Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marc Lipman, the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at IPFW. I want to welcome you to our Arts and Sciences Distinguished Lecture Series. The series has been going for about 20 years now, 22 years. We do this twice a year. Once a year we bring in a distinguished speaker from somewhere who does things that great universities always do. They teach, they educate us, they entertain us. Once a year, we do the same thing with a distinguished member of our own faculty, who also will teach and entertain and inform us. And I want to introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker, Professor Nancy Virtue from the Department of French. Although that's not the right name.
I'm very pleased this evening to introduce Professor Richard Johnson, our distinguished lecturer for arts and sciences for this year. Professor Johnson earned his PhD in German literature from Harvard University in 1968, and he taught 6 years at IU Bloomington before joining the Faculty of Modern Foreign Languages here at IPFW in 1974. He is Professor of German and Peace Studies and co-founder of the Peace and Conflict Studies program, which he directed for 15 years. Professor Johnson also co-founded the Center for Nonviolence in Fort Wayne and co-directed the center for several years. He has been an activist for over 40 years in movements seeking to provide nonviolent alternatives to war and family violence. He is also an accomplished author, and I won't attempt to pronounce the name of his book in German, but he is the author of the book I Write My Soul Free, Harmonizing the Whole Brain, which was published in 1990. And he's published many articles on German culture and on nonviolence, including European peace movements, engaged Buddhism, and Mahatma Gandhi. The Gandhi Reader he has edited, Gandhi's Experiments with Truth, Essential Writings by and About Mahatma Gandhi, is scheduled for publication by Lexington Books in the fall of this year. The name of Professor Johnson's presentation this evening is The Only Way to Stop Terrorism, Nonviolent Social Action. And I've been very much looking forward to his lecture because I know Richard to be an extremely clear and complex thinker, and I know that he will bring some much-needed insight and perspective to this topic. So please, everyone, welcome Professor Richard Johnson.
Well, I was told I'm supposed to educate and entertain. And I have to say that terrorism is not the most entertaining thing I've ever thought about. But we'll do what we can do. I want to express my gratitude first to Dean Marc Lipman of Arts and Sciences, the selection committee that came up with the choice for me to speak tonight, my beloved Department of Modern Foreign Languages that I have been a part of for 30 years, IPFW, which has allowed me to do so many things I want to do and has actually paid me. Hasn't overpaid me, but has paid me. But that's really between the university and the legislature. I'm very grateful also for Peace and Conflict Studies, something I've been involved with for quite a number of years. And I'm real grateful to Pat Ashton that he took it over this year so I don't have to direct it anymore. And I'm very grateful, too, also the worldwide peace and justice movement that I've been able to come into contact with people in various countries, and also specifically peace studies. Ken Brown, who's here tonight, and who directs the oldest peace studies program in the country, Manchester College, and many other programs have been so helpful to our program. Indiana has a number of fine programs. Excellent programs, and IPFW is the first public institution with a Peace and Conflict Studies program. I want to also thank my family because they've had to suffer through my writing this book this year that I thought would take a lot of time, but I had no idea how much time it would take. So I'm very grateful to them. Now, I'm working on an article on this topic that's due next week, and I won't turn in time, I'm sure. And it is the beginning, I think, of a book. So what I'm trying to do tonight is condense into a fairly short amount of time a lot of stuff. So I will stop at around 35 or 40 minutes, which is my assignment, and then we'll have questions and answers or comments. And in that time, I'll try to be as clear and informative as I can. You should have two handouts, a blue one and a green one. The blue one is two-sided and gives some of the major points I'd like to make, some of which I won't have time to make tonight, but you have them in writing. And then the green one is a short bibliography. So I've been thinking about this title in this country right now, and I was thinking the only way to stop terrorism, nonviolent social action. The quote, the first part is directly from Gandhi, the only way to stop terrorism. And I thought I would preview in one sentence what I'm going to be talking about as regards what terrorism is, and then I'm going to say a little bit about what I'm not going to say and what is not my perspective. I believe that terrorism is an ideological conflict, in this particular mega-terrorism we're dealing with now, between imperialism, with a capital I, and Islamic fundamentalism, both of which have been taken to a violent extreme. And I'm going to just for a moment take two people as the symbols of these two movements, President George W. Bush and Osama bin Laden. That being said, I will tell you what I'm not proposing. I'm not proposing that I put on my old love beads from the 60s. I'm not proposing that I have long hair for many reasons, and one of them is it's not possible, and I didn't really have long hair in the 60s either, though I tried. And I put on my Nehru jacket and my Gandhi cap, and I'm not proposing that I would hot-foot it to the mountains of Afghanistan or Pakistan, wherever Osama bin Laden is, but I would know that because of my deeply hippie intuitive nature. And I would find him in the cave in the moment, and I would come up to him and say, "Peace, dude. Let's talk this thing out. You've got Mr. Bush all wrong. He just wants peace and freedom and democracy, the American way, for everybody, and that means YOU." Now, I'm not doing that, personally because I think it would be dangerous, and I don't think it would be very effective. Nor am I suggesting that I do that with President Bush, nor am I suggesting that they sit down in that cave together. What I am suggesting is that nonviolent social action could be a context within which, over time, important social, political, cultural, and economic changes could be made to end terrorism. I want to say up front, too, because it's an important point, and I'll talk about it a little bit later if I have time, and that is that most nonviolent activists I know do not believe it's possible to exclude the use of violence at all times in all places. One of my students last year in the Intro to Peace and Conflict Studies, Laurie Ham, said nonviolence is only effective 99.9% of the time, and the rest of the time violence may well be necessary. So using Laurie's law, I would agree that we can't always exclude violence, particularly in cases of genocide and terrorism. So I want that stated up front because a lot of people worry that if you're talking about nonviolence, then you mean absolute nonviolence without any exceptions. And most of us believe that in certain cases it is impossible to avoid. Now, what I believe is real important with nonviolence is that we could de-escalate the conflict which is going on now. Right now it seems to be escalating. I also want to say that I treated the topic somewhat lightly at the beginning, but I understand it's not a light topic. I understand that with the 3,000 who died on 9/11 and the 6,000 or more who died in Afghanistan in the war there, and the thousands who have died and are continue to die in Iraq, that this is no light matter. The 190 more who died in Madrid, this is an open running sore in the global community, and it needs to be thought about seriously. Now, let me just say a few things that could work in even the short run. I think nonviolence generally takes a while, but there are certain things that could reduce terrorism. Three proposals that actually come from a number of people, including Osama bin Laden. One, withdraw U.S. troops from Saudi Arabia. Yeah. I know who that is. I do. Two, contribute to a lasting and just peace in Israel and Palestine by having two independent states. And 3, internationalize the occupation force in Iraq, and as soon as possible, get out. Now, how do you do that? One of them, I'm choosing my words very carefully, is to stage in the United States a bloodless coup, which is also called an election. And in that election, have somebody different be president. I believe the most likely one is Senator John Kerry. But whoever that is, the issue to me is right now we have a president who seems to be pushing very much for a solution based primarily on massive violence. And one advantage of Senator Kerry is that he has already come out for internationalizing the conflict in Iraq. Now, the idea I'm forwarding here is that we use all resources we have to create nonviolent alternatives to the things that create terrorism. And we'll talk about what those are. But I want to say all things possible on the local, national, and international level. Many times we feel powerless when we encounter something as awful as terrorism, and I don't believe we are. And I'll try to have some examples, and if we don't have enough here, then maybe we can have some more in the question and answer. Now, is it absurd, pie in the sky, utopian naivete to talk about looking at the issue of terrorism through the lens of nonviolence? I have 2 answers for that. One, yes, it is, in this way. We've never solved the problem of megaterrorism, this incredible conflict between the two sides, by nonviolent action, but then we've not solved it with anything. It's just getting worse. And one of the things I would say on a personal level, on an individual level, is if the only thing we can look for is more of the same kind of conflict, we might as well duct tape our windows and doors and hope that they hit Orlando or Seattle and not Churubusco, where I live. In fact, that is not the answer. And so why would it not be utopian to look at nonviolent social action? Well, I believe that certain virulent forms of terrorism have already been solved through nonviolent action. And I'd like to give a few examples. There are actually many. And one thing I want to ask you to think about is if it makes sense what I say, and if you haven't thought that nonviolent action has ended terrorism, perhaps it's because we live in a war culture, that doesn't allow us to think outside the box of a culture of war. The first example is Gandhi. Gandhi came to India in 1915 with about 20 or 25 activists after he'd spent 20 years in South Africa working out a method to confront unjust power through nonviolence. That was 20 or 25 people max who were working with him at that time. In 1930, 15 years later, there were 60,000 civil disobedient activists who were jailed, and probably at least 200,000 more who were active in the movement. In 1930, in the SALT campaign, most people believe that the British Empire lost any shred of an idea worldwide that they were morally superior to the Indians, and that it was just a matter of time before that empire ended, the strongest empire in the world. And 15 years later, by 1945-46, Lord Wavell, the Viceroy of India, wrote back to London that the British administration of India had lost its legitimacy among the Indian people. They could continue a while longer, but not much longer. He was a general, and he said, we can no longer count on the Indian troops under British command. Their allegiance has crossed over to Gandhi and the Indian National Congress. Now, what the heck happened? According to Gandhi, nonviolent social action is designed to transform the consciousness of the people as a whole. Here, the belief in Indian independence to such an extent that the greatest empire in the world could not stop it. Did the British commit acts of terror? Yes. There are many. The one that I would cite is the one in 1919. Gandhi said in 1919, for the first time, that the British were acting against the Indians in the spirit of terrorism, his words. And 2 weeks later, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered that troops open fire on unarmed Indians at a public square in Amritsar. Over 1,650 were wounded, 379 were killed. This was a turkey shoot, and this was done by the British. And there were many other acts of terror. And what happened? That terrorism ended. The terrorism on the part of Indians trying to fight the British, and the terrorism on the part of the British ended. And in fact, the two nations have cooperated quite a lot since then. So a major form of terrorism ended. As Gandhi stated in 1933, looking at terrorism of the Indians, which was still going on in 1933, and the counterterrorism of the government, I know that terrorism is taking deeper root owing to the counterterrorism of the British government. The counterterrorism is much more mischievous in its effects because it is organized and corrupts a whole people. Instead of rooting out terrorism, it creates an atmosphere for the approval of terrorist methods and gives them artificial stimulation. I find this statement one of the most insightful I've read about the cycle of terrorism and counterterrorism. And I would agree that the counterterrorism of a government is more pernicious than the counterterrorism of a small group because that government represents a lot of people. And if the people buy into that terrorism, then they themselves are corrupted by it. Counterterrorism stimulates terrorism, as Gandhi stated. Each side justifies their violence as a necessary response to the terrorism of the other side. Now, there are two other examples I want to just mention briefly because of time, but they're both important. One of them is the end of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, and the overthrow of the Soviet Union, almost all of which happened without a shot. How did that happen? The people changed how they thought, consciousness was changed, and hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions, but certainly hundreds of thousands of people participated directly in overthrowing a government which practiced terror. There's no doubt about it. Ask Chechens in the current situation and ask any of those subjected people. I was in East Germany in 69 and 76. There's no doubt that terrorism was practiced on the people. And the second example is an example from Germany. The Red Army faction was a major terrorist group in West Germany in the 1970s. And according to Jürgen Totenhöfer, who was a judge and a conservative member of the Bundestag, the German parliament, the German government used two methods to end this terrorism. He says, Härte und Gerechtigkeit, toughness and justice. I had to get a little German in here. Toughness and justice. He asserted that those people who supported the terrorists were weaned from their support by the sense of justice that the government acted upon. Toughness is necessary at times, of course, with terrorists, but also you need to end what is often called the terrorist-supporting communities. If those communities stop supporting terrorists, they can no longer continue. I do not have time to explain at length what nonviolent social action was for Gandhi. I do have some of that information on your blue sheet. But what I would say is that there are two parts. One of them is civil disobedience, saying no to a government or any group that is oppressing someone. He called it satyagraha, and it's much more complex than I can explain tonight. But the important thing is saying no to oppression. And the second part was the constructive program, a wide range of initiatives intended to uplift the Indian people from the bottom up, using a bridging technique of the privileged working side by side with the underprivileged in a number of programs, Hindu-Muslim unity, educational programs, uplift of untouchables, of women, of the poor, actually 21 programs in all. And this kind of work is going on in the world now, perhaps beyond his imagination. Right now, there are over 25,000 international non-governmental organizations doing this kind of work. In places like Iraq and Afghanistan, without that work, there would be total collapse in these populations. So there has been considerable work in that area. I'm arguing that nonviolent social action is a combination of these two factors. One, saying no to oppression, and two, saying yes to creating a better society from the bottom up. That, I believe, was Gandhi's plan, and that, I believe, is what can end terrorism. I would like to add that a definition here, and that is that nonviolent social action is using the least physical force necessary and the most spiritual or moral force possible to create a just and peaceful world. I say that because I believe that it's not always possible to use nonviolence in every situation, again, particularly in the case of genocide. However, I believe that resort to violence should be extremely rare. And let's take an example. I was reading Richard Falk's, one of his books, and Richard Falk said that after the attacks of 9/11, it would have made sense to have military action against specifically the al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan, and I can see the logic to that. However, this carpet bombing of innocent people, men, women, and children in Afghanistan, was for me terrorism. I don't see the necessity of that. I don't believe that the people of Afghanistan were responsible for the presence of the al-Qaeda camps, nor for the Taliban. And that's my opinion based on my research. I've given examples of terrorism, but I haven't given a definition yet, and that's extremely important. I will say that terrorism is a very contested issue, what it is. And I can't go into all of that in depth, but I would say in this country, by and large, by our government and by a certain number of scholars, terrorism is defined in a double standard way. Terrorism is what they do to us, and it's never what we do to them. And that's written in all kinds of documents. Particularly, there is a disinclination to believe that states commit terrorism. I believe that's completely false. And the reason I believe that is that, let's take an example. Hitler and his Nazi group committed terrorist acts before they had government power, and they performed the same acts, only more so, after they had government power. What's the difference? In fact, they had more power and more legitimacy once they controlled a state than they did beforehand. So I'm saying that terrorism is the use or threat of the use of violence, or the threat of the use of violence by an agent, a government or a non-government group or individual, in an ideological conflict, and I'm focusing on ideology, which appears so extreme that the agent believes he or she must force the opponent to acquiesce to his or her ideology. And I did say his or her, but mostly this is guys. There are exceptions. Terrorism involves a radical denial of common humanity across an ideological divide, an assumption that we are so fundamentally different from and superior to them, the other, that violence or the threat of violence must be used to coerce or intimidate them into acquiescing to our ideology. We have created a pervasive enemy image by our ideological definition of the other, unless they come over to our side. Terrorists create an exclusive ideological categories and tend to confine the wide range of human thought and behavior to those categories. Either you are with us or you're against us. I remember this very well in analyzing the language of Nazis. The either or, entweder oder, is very common in their writings. Terrorists dehumanize and demonize the other. Now, the conflict between militant Islamists and the West, particularly the United States, is one of the greatest dangers we have encountered. As weapons technology advances, weapons of mass destruction become more accessible to wider circles of people. Many are so overwhelmed by the real dangers confronting us that they can't imagine we can resolve this conflict between these two arch-enemies. Al-Qaeda having launched a spectacular attack that killed 3,000 people, possessing, even after the war in Afghanistan, billions of dollars in assets, according to the U.S. government, possible weapons of mass destruction, thousands of committed adherents, considerably more Muslims willing at least to harbor them, a much revered leader, and a strong ideology of Muslim unity, and a perpetual jihad against the evil infidels. The United States, having spearheaded wars that killed over 6,000 in Afghanistan and thousands more in Iraq, preparing to counter terrorist operations in dozens of countries, possessing perhaps trillions of dollars in assets, although lots of debts, and more weapons of mass destruction than all other countries combined, with millions of soldiers and hundreds of millions of supporters, a leader with an apparently strong domestic base of support, but limited international appeal, a well-orchestrated ideology of freedom and democracy masking imperialist designs, and a stated policy of eternal war. Perpetual jihad and eternal war carry with them the real possibility of an enormously expensive, ever-escalating, increasingly lethal conflict without any clear evidence that either side could possibly win. I argue that we really have to make a choice here, a fundamental choice. Will we rely primarily on de-escalation, on nonviolent social action, or will we rely primarily on force? All policy makers seem to agree that there needs to be some mix of diplomacy and heightened security measures and internationally coordinated intelligence, police, and military operations for sure. But where is our focus going to be? And what is the especially dangerous form of terrorism we're looking at, this mega-terrorism? It is a global ideological struggle between imperialism, which I define as U.S. military imperialism, and U.S.-led global capitalism. Each side is trying to force the other side to its side, or at least to stop what are considered to be incursions in culture. Now, I don't have time to look at all aspects of imperialism in depth, but there's lots of books that do. I recommend Noam Chomsky and Richard Falk and many others. But I would say, if living in the United States, if we only read the mainline corporate media, we have strong reason to believe simply, we are good, they are bad. They're trying to hurt us, we've got to kill them. Faster, more efficiently. We are reluctantly in a position of policing the world, and we're making it safe for democracy. Especially after the war in Iraq, world opinion is radically different from what we read in most of the mainline U.S. press. Since last year, particularly February of March of last year, a majority of Europeans believe that the greatest threat to world peace is not North Korea, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's the United States. Government, although most of them continue to love us, thank God. In the Middle East, last year a poll indicated that populations in each country opposed the U.S.-led invasion by overwhelming majorities, 92 to 98% in every country in the Middle East. People in the Middle East understand imperialism. Most of the world believes there is such a thing as imperialism and that it has two wings that make it fly, U.S. military and monopoly capitalism. To answer the question whether or not there's such a thing as U.S. military imperialism, let us take a sentence from President George Bush's speech on June 1st, 2002. Quote, America has and intends to keep military strengths beyond challenge, thereby making the destabilizing arms race of other eras pointless and limiting rivalries to trade and other pursuits of peace. Military strengths beyond challenge in the present and in the future sounds like military imperialism to me. And as to economic imperialism, that's a very big topic, but I will talk just a little bit about it. If trade increased the distribution of wealth in the world and helped reduce misery, then it would be a peaceful pursuit. But there's no evidence that that's happening. In fact, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. According to the United Nations Development Program, a quarter of the world's population, 1.3 billion people, live in severe poverty. Nearly 800 million people do not get enough food to eat, and about 500 million people are chronically malnourished. More than a third of the world's children are malnourished. In industrial countries, there are 100 million people living below the poverty line. More than 5 million people are homeless, and 37 million are jobless. According to Arundhati Roy, quote, in the past 10 years, the world's total income has increased by an average of 2.5% per year, and yet the number of poor in the world has increased by 100 million. Of the top 100 biggest economies, 51 are corporations, not countries. The top 1% of the world has the same combined income as the bottom 57%, and the disparity is growing. My colleague Michael Nagler at the University of Berkeley in California said that the 400 richest people in the world have the same income as the 3 billion poorest, one half of humanity. 400 equals 3 billion. Is there a relationship between military imperialism and the growth and spread of monopoly capitalism? I'll just give a statement from Tom Friedman of the New York Times in his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. Quote, the hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas. And the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technologies to flourish is called the U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. Extreme ideologies are dangerous to the world, I would argue. Islamic fundamentalism is terribly dangerous to Muslims, most of whom are very tolerant and moderate people. Al-Qaeda and other terrorists have killed other Muslims who get in their way. There were Muslims in the World Trade Center. Al-Qaeda is dangerous for everyone, including Al-Qaeda members. We must do all in our powers to end their domination as much as possible by peaceful means, by drying up the support they have among non-terrorists in the Muslim world. Without that support, they would fold in a short time. We cannot make Muslims withdraw that support. But as Totenhofer argues, with toughness and justice, we can't let Muslims know that we, not the extremists and Muslims, are on their side. Nonviolent social action could do that in ways that wars cannot. By the same token, I believe that not only that imperialists exist and that they are extremists, although they seem normal to many of us, and that to the extent that we disagree with them and from social movements to reduce their influence, we can well come under attack. We, the people, must find a moderate path which slowly but surely deconstructs the military imperialism and monopoly capitalism in favor of a reduced military and a much more humane and moral set of economic and political policies. The solution, I argue, is moderate ideologies and actions which de-escalate the conflict. First of all, the rule of law, defined here to exclude corporal and other extreme forms of punishment, and nonviolent social action. I believe the rule of law is actually fundamentally nonviolent because it separates the person from the action and seeks more reconciliation than retribution. And we need to say no to oppression of all sorts and yes to constructive work. I would propose 7 forms of nonviolent action. And of course, there's many other numbers that you can come up with. But as I mentioned on the sheet, I would propose working toward true democracy, talk about a little bit about what that is, moral economics, gradual disarmament and nuclear abolition, humane global governance, gender justice, intra and inter-religious and secular dialogue, and nonviolent education. These forms must be undertaken by practical idealists. Gandhi called himself a practical idealist, and I love that phrase because we need ideals. Everybody works to a certain extent by ideals, but we need to be practical. We need to form communities of service that are decentralized, and we need to work on all levels, local, national, and transnational. Now, what is true democracy? Gandhi said true democracy is something that we all want, but we've never known. He was particularly critical of Western democracies, which say we're democratic, but which oppress other people. And he knew that well, being in a subject nation. Well, one of the things that true democracy is it's not imperialism. Jonathan Schell argues convincingly to me that there's a great tension between imperialism and democracy. The more imperialism a nation has, the less democracy it has. The more it tries to oppress others, the more it oppresses its own people. If you look at the United States, there's just low levels of voting and even lower levels of working for candidates, low levels of public education. Money, did you notice this? Money seems to play a pretty major role in American politics. Most presidents and most of the Congress, especially the Senate, are rich. Some can be bought, I imagine, but others simply vote certain ways because they're of the moneyed class. True democracy is based on highly educated, involved, and moral citizens. Education, which was so central to Gandhi's constructive program, is a necessity in developing informed citizens. And moral, I mean working for the common good. Broad-based coalitions are necessary to provide it's necessary to provide a certain amount of money for candidates, but I believe that should be done by the percentage of vote they've had in the last election. True democracy needs civil disobedience. The School of Americas in the United States in Fort Benning, Georgia, trains Latin Americans to kill their people. There's regularly been nonviolent action against that. Civil disobedience is necessary when a nation goes beyond what its true democratic ideals are. And we need to end poverty, racism, classism, homophobia, and all kinds of ills that are in this country and which destroy true democracy. I would like to say a little bit about moral economics. I'll quote Gandhi on this in a speech he gave in 1916. He wrote, "If we will but clean our houses, our palaces and temples of the attributes of wealth, and ensure them instead the attributes of morality, we can offer battle to any combination of hostile forces without having to carry the burden of a heavy militia. Let us seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and the irrevocable promise is that everything will be added with us. These are real economics. May you and I treasure them and enforce them in our daily life." So I'm citing a Hindu who's citing the Bible. Of course, he knew the Bible quite well, and particularly the Bhagavad Gita. And what he's saying is we have to first take care of our own hearts and minds and think about the well-being of others. And we need to reduce our income, reduce the amount of money that we have. We need to share. And we need to look at reducing our wants. We live in a society that seeks to multiply our wants enormously. Whew. And how can that change? We cannot end the untrue democracy that we have unless we drastically reduce our wants. Gandhi believed the most important goal of moral economics is eliminating poverty. Many people are calling for a Marshall Plan for the world, beginning here at home. There's something called the Tobin tax, which was proposed 25 years ago. It would be 0.5% tax on international trade, and that would raise more than enough money to end world poverty. According to the United Nations, it would take $80 billion a year to end poverty. That's 20% of the U.S. budget for defense. Now, that $80 billion seems like a lot of money to me, but it's not a lot of money looking at the international trade that goes on. And at one point, it was stated the poor will always be with us. Now it's a choice. And we have not made that choice as a society and as societies. And I think it's extremely important. I just can cover briefly a few of the other points. One of them is the notion of gradual disarmament and nuclear abolition. I remember in 1964 standing up and saying, with my sign, my very big sign, my very wordy sign, I support a 10% unilateral reduction in U.S. nuclear forces. Interesting enough, it went up and it's gone down. But we still have an enormous number of warheads. And a number of people, including Lee Butler, who used to be head of the Strategic Air Command, has called for nuclear abolition. Jonathan Schell, in his most recent book, and it's in your bibliography, is arguing that nuclear bombs are essentially a technology and an ability that people have within their minds, and that we need to reduce them altogether or to a very small number, because he said no particular danger would happen so fast that they couldn't be developed if they needed to be. And we're spending so much money is going for these bombs. And conventional bombs are pretty terrible too, as many of us know from the fire bombs already in World War II. The last point that I'm going to talk about, I have to skip a few of them now, and that is, I do want to say this issue of dialogue. You know, Gandhi and King, Dr. King, both believed that the world could change because they met and knew personally and loved people who were of the other group. Gandhi knew Brits, whom he loved and who loved him. King knew white people who treated him as a human being. One of the most important things that can happen in our communities is that we hang out with and talk and get to know folks of different faiths, including Muslims. Is this effective and important? You know, there's supposed to be terrorist cells in the United States. They're supposed to be right around here. as possible right around here. Why can't we talk with people? It seems to me sometimes dialogue can change people. I think that's so important that we do that. And the last point, of course, is nonviolent education. Most of my students find it the real linchpin. When they learn about the nonviolence, they say, why didn't we know about this before? Why didn't we learn about this in high school? Gandhi believed that it was absolutely essential, and he said we need to educate head, heart, and hand. Sometimes at the university, we only educate the head. We have to do it all. We have to learn to love in our actions, in the world. There's a lot of change that's happening in universities. 250 to 300 peace studies programs across the country. I believe the conflict resolution that kids are learning in schools, and they're so good at it. These are programs that if we do it at the very basic level, we can learn to resolve conflicts in ways that will change things. There's so much to do, and we can all lend a hand. In my view, a change of ideology, a change of consciousness, a paradigm shift, a change of public opinion, and a change from 5,000 years of being Goliath, the culture of war, to the 98 years of nonviolent social change will make the difference. You know, it was September 11th, 1906, when Gandhi started his first nonviolent campaign. It would be a big challenge to make these changes. But if we don't, the extremists will win. And if they win, we all lose, including the extremists. Thanks.
Questions, comments, disagreements?
Surely everyone agrees. Yes.
We seem to think in this country about terrorism, they find it happened and not before. This current war in Iraq was billed initially as a preemptive action.
Yes.
I wonder about your thoughts of the preemptive application of nonviolent social action.
Well, we sure need to get started on it. You can't wait. Nonviolence tends to be slow. So we need to get right to it. I don't know that I like preemptive, but we certainly need to get right to it. There's no doubt about it. Many times, it's nonviolent actions that are already in place. You know, the 1993 accords between Israelis and Palestinians, which was terribly limited, I know, but extremely important. At least a dialogue was going on. You know, there was a professor at Harvard for 30 years would bring in folks from all over the world to learn conflict resolution. He brought in Palestinians and Israelis, among others. The people who negotiated that agreement in 1993 knew each other from Cambridge. That's 30 years of work, and people knew each other, knew a method, and cared about each other as human beings. So it seems to me that's the fundamental work that we have to do to try to change the conditions as soon as possible. Preemption, I think, the famous speech by Eisenhower, his last speech, where he talks about the military-industrial complex, he speaks absolutely crystal clear against preemption and says it does not belong to the American tradition. He was a Republican. Anyway. Yes, you should.
Richard, thank you very much for a very informative talk.
I'd like to just make a couple of comments on Gandhi. I know you read more of Gandhi than I had. But at one time, I believe he defined violence as not doing anything is a form of violence.
Yeah.
Certainly. And he said that if you tolerate something that is injustice or unjust, then you are participating in violence.
Exactly. He wrote so many things. He wrote 100 volumes. We have them all here. Go read them if you'd like. But he wrote so much about violence. But one of the most important things he said is we have to be proactive. We have to get involved and do stuff. And he said, he talked about nonviolence, ahimsa. He talked about that, but he said, in its positive aspect, it's love. It's breaking down barriers and saying, how can I foster the very best in my brothers and sisters all over the world? That's what he believed was essential. So it was a very different definition of what violence is and how to end it. You're absolutely.
Comment I just want to quickly make is that not only he talked about disobedience, but he said non-cooperation
Yes.
is very necessary. And I just wanted you to clarify. You said that some form of violence sometimes is necessary, like in genocide. Could you clarify that?
Well, yes, I will. I'll talk a little.
little
Yeah, that's a big issue, and of course it's a real problem. But what I would say is that Gandhi sometimes spoke from an absolutist position on nonviolence that must always be applied, and other times he did not. He talks, for example, in the 30s, as I recall, about a man who comes into a village, runs amok is the term, and starts killing people in a wild frenzy. He said he would use deadly force to stop that person because not doing it would actually produce more violence. In Rwanda, the UN field representatives discovered that this conflict was going to happen. They were clear about it. And so they went to the United Nations and they asked for negotiations in Rwanda. They asked for peacekeeping forces, and the Security Council, specifically the United States, said no. We know that hundreds of thousands of people died. Hundreds of thousands of people died, hacked to death. Now, Gandhi spoke against pacifism as, I go over here and I keep myself clean and pure, and you all let yourself do whatever you need to do. In my view, in the case of genocide, it seems to me sometimes we would have to do things. A peacekeeping force might have gone into Rwanda and might have caused the death of some of the people doing the butchery. That would be sad. That would be getting their hands bloody, but perhaps by killing 100, 500, 1,000 people, maybe they could save 500,000 to 1 million. So this is the problem. The issue is, what is our aim? If our aim is peace and justice, and if our aim is listening to people and learning, I believe that Gandhi is saying, and I believe personally, that there are times when war is unavoidable. Gandhi participated in the Zulu uprising as a medical orderly, as you know. He participated in the Boer War, as you know, and he was a recruiting sergeant for the British Army in World War I. So he did participate in certain cases because he said, I'm a member of the British Empire, I have to serve in certain circumstances. And he felt that serving in the medical corps was the same as being a soldier. So what he said is, life is complex, and as you know, Hinduism says we can't keep our hands clean all the time. There are conflicts that happen in the world. How do we minimize violence? Now, other times he said, under no circumstances, but what he said is, human beings are split. We are not totally nonviolent beings, and we're not totally violent beings. We're split. The idea is to increase the nonviolence, but acknowledge there are other parts of us. And that one of the greatest things about Gandhi was that, to say, I have violence in me. When I look at Osama bin Laden and George Bush, they're saying all the violence is in the other person. I think that's fundamentally wrong. It's wrong about me. I've got both. Gandhi had both. Osama bin Laden does, and so does George Bush. Let's acknowledge what's wrong with us, and how do we clean up and change that? In trying to solve the problem with India and Pakistan, what Gandhi wanted to do is talk with both sides, and he wanted to say, both sides acknowledge you're doing wrong things here. Start with yourself. Turn the searchlight inward, he said. And if we turn the searchlight inward, then we are not always projecting the evil onto the other. So I think that's real important. Oh, no. Well, you want to? Go ahead.
With international capitalism the way it is, how do you propose, or what have you written about the humane global governance idea?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I forgot. I'm supposed to stay over here. Humane global. How? We just restated. I got confused.
With the power of international corporations, the question I have is, what are your views on humane global governance? Because it appears as if these corporations really get around governance.
Yeah, they sure do. And we look, again, 51 of the 100 largest financial entities are corporations. That's a very big issue. I would say two things. One of them, I'm working on it. I don't have all the solutions. That's part of what I want to do in my research. But I would say there are a number of answers that folks have given. Richard Falk argues that you can limit the power of corporations, that they are not of infinite power. Another thing, of course, would be the syndicalist view, and that is to say that corporations ought to be owned by the people who work there. That workers ought to do. If you know about the Mondragon group in the Basque region of Spain, that worked out from 1945 on, it's a huge corporation with all kinds of things they do. They make refrigerators, they have banks, they have schools, and all of it is owned by the people, and all the decisions are made collectively. So that's one other option. Something has to change, and I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. One of the things I want to say is I don't believe that there's one single answer to any of these enormous problems. Nonviolent education is going to happen differently at Manchester from here. So I believe it's grabbing on and seeking to make change. I mean, one of the things, for example, we could look at oil. Everybody's heard of oil? According to Robert Kennedy Jr., if the United States were to change its consumption of gas and have cars getting, instead of an average of low 20 miles per gallon, get the mid-40s, we would not need any Middle East oil. That would be a major change in the country. And that's something that human beings can do by the change in their cars. We just made a change from a car that got 23 miles per gallon to one that's getting 46. I know that doesn't change the whole country in a moment, and I know that there are only 50,000 hybrid cars that were sold last year out of 17 million. But I would still argue that by public policy, in a number of areas, we can make changes that reduce the power of capital. Obviously, alternative technologies is a real important answer to that. And the way we buy things, buying fair-traded things, rather than ones that are concentrated in large corporations. So I would say there's a lot of answers, and I don't have one. Yes?
Okay, first, I really appreciate your comment about befriending the other. That's something many preach, but very few do. And following in the line of violence by omission, do you think that the large monolingualism in this country helps continue the ignorance because it subjects the population to a mediated version of the world that is largely motivated by political interests?
I do. So the key issue is what role does English play in the world and in this country and in only knowing one language? I'm both a language teacher and a teacher of nonviolence and peace studies. And I notice how difficult it is in some courses to get people to learn the language. And one day I was just, grousing about when I was looking at my papers, and I said, I wonder how difficult it was during the Roman Empire to get these Romans to learn any other language but Latin. And I said, I bet it was real hard. I bet there's some connection between empire and one language. I love English. I think it's a cool language. But there are so many languages in the world, and so much that needs to learn. I remember former Governor Orr in Indiana talking with businessmen, and he asked them, what language should we learn? And he said, learn the language of your customer. It is a situation that is a severe problem in this country. And I see many people I know who are learning at least one or more languages, and I celebrate that, and I think it's very important. I think it changes how we think and gives us a new perspective. Yes?
Besides the one language, how about issues of religion and faith, especially from a Gandhian, the revealed truth kind of concept and the exclusive perspective of Christianity and Islam and Judaism in certain cases, especially those three religions.
Yeah, right. Well, Gandhi was very disturbed by any kind of exclusive claim of any religion. He believed that exclusive truth claims were dangerous. He believed that nonviolence was necessary because we're all, he hoped, seeking for truth, but we need to use love as our method because we don't really know what it is. As a Hindu, he worked, of course, a great deal on Hindu-Muslim unity. He was very well versed in the Bible, particularly the New Testament, particularly the Sermon on the Mount. And he believed in an inclusive religion. I love this. He believed that each one of us in a faith should convert to the deepest core of that faith. And if we do that, we'll get along with everybody because the deepest core of every faith is consonant with the deepest core of every other one. And then he included secular folks. He included atheists. He said, Bradlaugh, one of the great British activists for Indian freedom, was an atheist. And he said he had deeper faith than almost anybody who called himself a Christian that he knew. He said there's Christianity of Christ, which he adored. He loved Christ. And there's Christianity of imperialism. And he said that's the danger. And we have all of these things. I think that Al-Qaeda and all these groups, they're using religion in such a twisted way that it's essentially a political ideology masking as religion. That's what I think. At least if you look at the greater and the lesser jihad and all those kinds of things. I don't think it's real. And I think it's very, very dangerous. In any faith, the Hindutva movement among Hindus is the same thing. It's an amazingly, the Hindutva movement is amazingly similar to the extremists among Christians, Muslims, and Jews. It's pretty much the same thing, I think. Yeah, he was clear about that. Inclusive faith, learning the faith of others to strengthen your own. This was his approach, and he practiced it. Did the fasts of other faiths, sang the songs, read the verses. He thought that was essential. Yes.
Richard, I'm having a little bit of a problem with the notion of extremism. It seems to me that in the world today and throughout most of modern history, imperialists have been the normative order. And anything that deviates from that, anything that resists the imperialist trend or powers is defined as extremist or terrorist or revolutionaries or nationalist or what have you. So when you use the word that imperialists are extremists, I'm wondering in what context that you're coming from, because obviously most of this population in this country doesn't view themselves as imperialists.
Or extremists. Right. We're normal.
In terms of imperial powers, rival any other historical imperialist power that precedes us. So I'm curious as to, from what vantage point do you claim legitimacy in defining the United States as being extremist, even though in some respects, given the context of world history, we're really pretty much an imperialist power like our predecessor, the British, who we rebelled against, and the French, and we go to the Portuguese in terms of their empire. I mean, the history of the world is the history of empires. So, why did the United States and Bush, an imperial president, or what he called himself, a war president, why did he claim him to be an extremist?
Well, I'm seeking a paradigm shift here, that's for sure. I'm saying that from the vantage point of nonviolence, from the vantage point of Gandhi, from the vantage point of the golden mean of Buddhism, from various traditions which are defined as extreme or defined as outside the norm, these things are dangerous and extreme. There's no doubt about it. We live in a culture of war. And from the perspective of a culture of war, what President Bush is doing, what Tony Blair is doing, what the British Empire did, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, all of them are perfectly normal. But why take that on? If we lived in Nazi Germany, certain things would be normal. Do we have to accept that as normal? I believe as thinking people, we get to decide what paradigms we want to go with. So as I read Gandhi, in 1980 I decided I'm not going to focus primarily on violence, though I'll try to understand it. I'm not going to give up trying to understand it. I'm going to try to focus primarily from the perspective of nonviolence. And if I look at the world from that perspective, what George W. Bush is doing seems extreme to me. killing 6,000 people, innocent people, because 3,000 innocent people were killed, doesn't make sense. It makes sense from the standpoint of imperialism, absolutely. But I want to get out of that paradigm, and I want to look at the world in a different way, what Elise Boulding calls a culture of peace. From a culture of peace, what happens in this country is weird. From a culture of war, it's mainline, normal, and right. But am I going to let the corporate media, the government, etc., define my reality? I don't think so. That's part of non-cooperation. Non-cooperation is definitely not only civil disobedience. Non-cooperation means I live my life over here. In the 80s, in Germany, a number of the movements were called Randbewegungen, peripheral movements. A little bit of feminism, a little bit of peace, a little bit of ecology, And these movements said, no, we're the norm. Valuing the experience of women, working for peace, having sustainable societies where we're not destroying the environment, that's the norm. So that's the redefinition involved, and it certainly doesn't fit for the Bush team. But I do think a growing number of Americans are changing, and look at the world now, since February of March of last year. Look at the world. The world is saying, we don't buy American imperialism. It exists, and it's not good. It is not something that we buy into. Remember the New York Times article said there are now two world powers in the United States and world opinion. And right now we are losing, we, meaning imperialism, are losing, and I believe something else is happening. 12 to 15 million people demonstrated a little over a year ago in the world against this. That's unprecedented. I think there's a paradigm shift going on. Slower than I want. Yes.
Fort Wayne Peace Action Coalition would like to invite everyone to join us on the courthouse green the first Saturday of every month. We are going to meet to nonviolently protest the current policies, try to end the occupation of Iraq. Appreciate anyone who could to join. There's leaflets at the top of the stairs, a new light green flyer. Anybody who could post those in a place with like-minded people, we'd appreciate it. Appreciate the work the professor's done speaking at rallies.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to mention, too, that you should get on the listserv that Dave Lambert has, because it keeps you informed. It's real. Dave is here, and this gentleman and others would be able to let you know how to do that. It makes it possible to have lots of information. Yes?
I wanted to ask, what do you suggest as far as keeping people informed? You mentioned that, like your regular network news or the media, we're not really hearing everything. What should we do? Where can we look for information?
commondreams.org, Alternet, Fort Wayne Peace in Action has a number of links. When I was young, I remember finding the I.F. Stone Weekly. And that was all there was. No, there were other things. But basically, this was this incredible thing that became my sort of Bible, One guy doing all this incredible investigative journalism in D.C. But there are enormous resources available to us. And one of the most important things is to get on some of those webs and read people from other countries. Read Arundhati Roy. Read folks who come at this from a completely different place. I just finished reading a couple of books by Tariq Ali. And my heavens, he said he went through the Middle East this last year, and he said, nobody believes what the United States is saying. Think about that. Contrast that, and then here you are in Fort Wayne. I don't think I could have made this talk on September the 12th, 2001. I think it would have been dangerous to my health. So I think that's a statement that's important. So I think getting as many other sources and getting on the web and surfing and spending the time will be well worth your while.
I think we have time for one more.
Yes.
If our efforts fail and terrorism increases, could our fate be that of the Romans?
Sure. I think that all empires end. Look at the 20th century. All territorial empires ended. Ottoman, Habsburg, British, Soviet. None of them made it. The non-territorial, the United States, did make it. It's very complex and very interesting. But I think whether terrorism ends tomorrow or not, the United States empire will only last a certain length of time. I don't know how long that will be, but I think that the handwriting is on the wall. I did make one prophetic statement in my life, and I don't know if I can make another one, but I did in 1988 say the Cold War is over in the hearts and minds of the majority of Europeans. In not very long, I thought about a generation, this Cold War will end and the Soviet Union, their dominance of Eastern Europe will end. And I wrote that, but my article came out after it was all over. So my prophetic statement was blown because things change so rapidly. But I don't think the United States empire will last very long at all. That's my view. Thanks, Marc.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of the school, I get to present you with a certificate of appreciation presented to Richard L. Johnson on behalf of the school for being our spring distinguished lecturer. And I'd like to invite everyone to a modest reception, cookie and punch probably, traditional arts and sciences punch, right outside the door. And thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.